Hello, Mum. Hello, world. Excellent. It's my very great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, our plenary speaker. When I spoke to Sugata, I asked him how he would like to be introduced, and he said, briefly. He then went on to say that sometimes he's introduced as that professor bloke from Newcastle. He also said that some people introduce him as the Slumdog Millionaire Professor, sometimes shortened to Slumdog Professor, because as perhaps you know, his work actually inspired someone to write the book that became the film Slumdog Millionaire. Sugata is currently Professor of Educational Technology at the School of Education, Communication and Language Sciences at Newcastle University, England. He is well known not just for being a keen supporter of Newcastle United, but also he is perhaps very well known for his hole-in-the-wall experiments and is widely cited in works on literacy and education. Fortunately or unfortunately for some of us, he's not going to dwell on his early work in which he discovered the structure of organic molecules and determined their function more than the constituent atoms. You can all read that up for yourselves. But he's here to talk to us about his love of education and the way he is transforming the way we conceive of education. So can we please give a warm IATEFL conference welcome to Sugata Mitra.
Thank you, George, and good morning. I hope you've had a good 4 days, and I am coming in on the last day, so one of two things can happen. Either what I say kind of sums up what you heard over the last 4 days, or it goes entirely against whatever it is that you discussed. So we'll see as we go along. I'm just going to tell you this, tell you a sequence of work which leads to a certain kind of conclusion. That conclusion is not perhaps entirely cast in stone, but the experimental results are there. And what I think would be really useful for me and perhaps for you is to look at what these experiments are saying and then put together in your mind what you think that conclusion might be. To start with, I'm going to talk about a few things that we know from experimental results, and then I'm going to talk about a few things that we don't know and we need to find out. Well, firstly, we know that it's difficult to get good teachers in remote places. I mean, that's kind of, you could treat it as obvious, but I do have a bit of data which might be interesting. About 7 or 8 years ago, I did a small experiment. The experiment was to take, to go out of New Delhi, India, and drive down into rural India, leaving all the built-up places behind, and go deeper and deeper into rural India. And every time we encounter a primary school, we would stop and we would administer a test of English, math, and science, a basic government test. And then we came back to Delhi and we totaled up the marks for each school and we plotted it against the distance from Delhi. And this is what came out. Now Now that's, in a way, a peculiar graph because uh, there doesn't seem to be a reason why schooling should get worse as you get further or more remote from cities. The schools that we looked at were all government schools, so they have the same amount of funding, they have the same kind of buildings, they usually have the same number of teachers. They're not fantastic, but they're identical. So why would the results come down as we go more into rural India? I found the answer to that quite easily by asking just one question in each of those schools. The question was to the teacher and or teachers, and the question was, would you like to work somewhere else? So when you ask this question in Delhi, the primary school teacher says, no, that's fine, I'm quite all right here. It's a big city, I've got good health care, entertainment, good education for my children and so on, I'm okay. I don't want to go anywhere else. You go into the rich suburbs of Delhi and it's even better. They say, no, we absolutely don't want to go anywhere because, everything's just fine. Then you go about 50 miles out of Delhi and then they say, well, it's a bit of a drive, but yes, we are happy. We don't have all those traffic problems of Delhi and so on, but we have the advantages of Delhi, so we're okay. You go 100 miles out of Delhi, and then they say, well, it is, Delhi is quite far away, and yeah, it's okay over here, but I wouldn't mind getting a little closer to Delhi. At 250 miles from Delhi, they say, anywhere but here. Okay. So what do the teachers try to do? They try to get a job in Delhi. Who succeeds? Well, obviously the good ones. So you have the good teachers migrating up to Delhi. How would you solve a problem like that? Well, you could, for example, tell the teachers, I'm going to pay you more if you work in a remote place. I tried asking the teachers this, and that what if you were paid more? Well, the teachers who were 200 miles away from Delhi said, have you seen the place I live in? What would I do with money in that place? What would I spend on? Okay. So that didn't work. The government tried a different stance. The government said, what we will do is we will train the teachers who work in these remote areas until they become really good. And what do you think will happen to the teacher when she becomes really good? She goes off to Delhi. So that problem doesn't get solved. It's a social problem. Teachers are human beings. They want a good standard of living like anybody else. So if you put them in a place where they cannot get that, they try to move away. When I came to England in 2006, I thought I would not see this problem. And indeed, it doesn't exist here because in a developed economy, rural England and urban England have more or less the same facilities everywhere, maybe a little more of it somewhere and a little less, but you have all the basics in position. And indeed, rural England can be really beautiful. People can choose to live there rather than live in a crowded city. When I tried to look for results similar to these, I did not find them. There was no relationship with geography. But if you look at the GCSE results, GCSE is the end of school examination here in the UK. If you look at the results are not all uniform. The results are, vary over a huge spectrum. You have really good schools and you have really bad ones. So what would explain the variation for this country? I took the data from Northeast England, which is where I live. It's up there between here and Scotland. And I took the data from over there and I tried to look for a correlation. Does it correlate with anything? And I found a correlation, an interesting correlation. Here it is. What you have there are the GCSE results on the y-axis. And on the horizontal axis, you have a number which I need to explain to those of you who do not live in the UK. It's called the density of council housing. Now, council housing is low-cost or subsidized housing for disadvantaged people. You know, people with various kinds of socio-economic disadvantages, maybe disabilities, or whatever. They're given lower-cost housing by the government. These are called council houses. Some places have lots of council houses, and some places have fewer. So there's a number called the density of council housing. If you plot the density of council housing against the GCSE results, you get that graph. The higher the density, the poorer the results. So I started traveling and, going to these places of high council housing density. And if you were to do that, you would immediately notice that those places are a little different from the places which have lower density of council housing. Different as in, you might find graffiti on the walls or, litter on the streets. Sometimes you find drug problems, alcohol problems, that kind of thing. And if you talk to the primary school teachers in these high council housing density places, they would say, look, the children are lovely, but the thing is, it's not a very safe place to live and work in. So, they too would like to go to a safer place. You can't blame them for doing that. And that seemed to explain what was happening over here. So, at this point, I realized that we are looking at remoteness in two different ways. When you look at India, you're looking at remoteness in terms of geography, where it's hard to get to or whatever. In England, we were looking at remoteness in a socio-economic sense, and that there were areas even within large cities, which would be considered socio-economically remote. I started looking at world data and discovered that this problem exists everywhere on the planet. There are places which are remote because of different reasons. It can be socio-economically remote, it can be ethnically remote, religiously remote, racially remote, whatever. Each of these areas suffer from a primary schooling problem. But what can we do about it? This is a social issue. It cannot be solved by teacher training. It cannot be solved by paying teachers more. Is there a way to solve this problem by taking the teacher out of the equation? And that's easier said than done. But I decided to try a simple experiment. Computers work the same way wherever they are. So whether you have a computer in remote India or whether you have a computer in remote Britain, they would work the same way. Now you might say, but a computer can't replace a teacher, which is quite right. But I'm not going to say that we are about to try that. All that I'm saying is that a computer, whatever it can do for children, will do it to the same extent wherever it is. The question is, what can it do? About 15 years ago, I came to know that groups of children can learn to use the internet on their own. The way I found this out was in Delhi, where I used to teach people how to write computer programs. And these were very expensive courses. So only rich people's children could attend them. I was not very happy doing this because where I used to work, right next door there was a slum. An sprawling urban slum, and it had lots of children in it. And I used to wonder, how many good programmers am I missing because there's nobody to teach them? and they can't afford to come and take these courses. So how is it going to help us as a nation or as a world to make this distinction between poor children and rich children? But then, where am I going to get the teachers from? Who is going to go and teach computers in a slum? And I'm talking about 1999, when this experiment was done. So I did this simple experiment, which was to find out what would happen if you gave a computer to these poor children. Just gave it to them. And people said, well, shouldn't somebody show them what to do with it? And I said, no, because we can't find people to do that. So I'm not saying that I'm not going to show them how to use it because I don't want to, but because it is not replicable or sustainable to try that. I'm just going to give it to them. When I did that, well, the first question is, how do you give a computer in a slum? There's no place to put it, firstly. So I followed the example of banks. You know, banks put computers all over the place in ATMs. So I made myself a do-it-yourself ATM and stuck it into the wall of a slum with a touchpad. It was running Windows, and it had an internet connection, and it was all in English. The children in those days, they didn't know any English, they'd never seen a computer before, and they didn't know what the internet was. So the computer was about 3 feet off the ground. So the children came running in because it was about their height, and they said, what is it? And at that point, I had to take a really hard decision. Should I tell them or should I not? And I decided I would not, because if I did, then there would be one point of intervention which I cannot duplicate all over the world. Do you see the point I'm trying to make? That any human intervention has to be replicable, otherwise your model is not sustainable. So I decided I will cut out all intervention. So I said, when the children said, what is it? I said, I don't know. And they said, can we touch it? And I said, well, it's on your side of the wall, so you can do what you like. And I left it there. And about 8 hours later, my colleagues reported that the children were surfing, and they were teaching each other how to surf. So, which was, you know, and you must remember, this is 1999, you know, computers are very expensive, they're taught to people. I guess there would maybe 1 or 2 people in this audience who would remember those days where there used to be a teacher who would say, this is called a monitor, and this is called a mouse. You know, and so on. So in those days, how were they doing this? How were they surfing? And what were they understanding? My friends and my colleagues said it's very simple. You've got this big computer school next door where you do your teaching, and your students pass by all the time. So somebody just saw them, you know, scratching their heads, and went and showed them how to use the mouse. And I thought, yeah, well, that makes sense. So I decided that I would repeat the experiment. And I did so. I went about 200 miles away from Delhi into those places where good teachers don't go. In fact, to a village which had none, which had no teachers, but it had a school. You know, in India, you do have some places where you have schools, but the schools don't have any teachers. It's only years later that we realized that that might be a good thing. But, but there was this school, and it didn't have any teachers, and I put this computer in the wall in that school, and there was no place to stay, so I went away. And I said the same things to the children. I said, I don't know what all this is, and you do what you like. I came back after a couple of months, and as we had seen in Delhi, I found that the children were actually playing games on the computer. And when they saw me, they said, you've come back. You see, we need a faster processor and a better mouse. So, 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 so I was quite taken aback. And they were using these words. They were using faster processor. So I said, how did you learn all these words? And that's when I got dragged out of my original subject, which was physics and computer science, into education. That one instant was when I got dragged out of the subject. Because what they said, so, thank you. What they said to me, these 9, 10-year-olds, was, you've given us a machine that works only in English, and he was saying that as a complaint. You've given us this machine which works only in English, so we had to teach ourselves English in order to use it. So I said, is that possible? That they actually taught themselves. Anyway, so we did a lot of work after that. Some colleagues of mine measured how many words are they using, how many words do they understand. And we found that they had a functional understanding of English which was sufficient for them to navigate the machine. What was causing this kind of self-taught English to happen? Well, unfortunately, the only conclusion I could come to was that this kind of learning was happening because I wasn't there. Okay? And I thought, well, that's kind of cool. So you can have learning happen if the teacher is not there. Is the opposite true? That you can stop the learning if the teacher was there? We'll see about that in a moment. But there it was. The conclusion was kind of staring at us. Anyway, after that I got some funding. I got some funding from the World Bank because they were very excited about this whole thing. And they said, you know, is this for real? Can you measure this properly? So I spent the next 5 years measuring it, doing, you know, sort of, I would put these hole-in-the-wall computers into different places, take a random sample, study their baselines, and do all the usual things. And here's a look at those 5 years. This, by the way, is the first day. This is 26th of January, 1999. And on your right is an 8-year-old. To his left is a student. She is 6, and he is teaching her to browse. He doesn't know English. So we got exactly identical results. You know, it was almost like doing an experiment in science. I was plotting computer literacy against time in each of these places. And it looked like this. All India. What that graph actually is telling us, I'll just tell you what that graph is saying. I won't go into the details of it. What it's saying is that groups of children given access to the internet and left unsupervised will, in a period of 9 months, reach the level of competency in computing literacy, the same level of competency in computing literacy as the average office secretary in the West. So it raised a few questions about training and the purpose of training. So at that point, the only question in my mind was, of course I was quite amazed by the results myself, but the question in my mind was, how does this happen? How does this happen with such completely replicable results? And I had no clue. You know why I had no clue? Now I'll tell you something really interesting about these experiments. The press called them the hole-in-the-wall experiments. If you want to find out what's happening at the hole in the wall, so you are a social science researcher, you take your notebook and you go to the hole in the wall and you observe. And you see a group of children milling around the computer and doing something quite amazing. And you say, so what are you doing? And all these 9-year-olds turn around and tell you, nothing. And after that, they stop doing whatever it is they were doing. You go away, and you come back after a couple of hours, and something amazing is going on. And you ask them, what are you doing? And they say, nothing. Okay? It reminded me of my old subject, physics. The observer changes the result. So I said, now how am I going to ever find out? And people said, well, it's simple, put in a hidden video camera. But I couldn't do that because that's not ethical. If you put a camera there on children, then you have to tell them. As soon as you tell them there's a camera, they stop doing everything. Or they do it differently. What they actually do is they keep turning around to the camera and making faces at it. So that doesn't work either. So I couldn't find out. I could only publish that this is what it does, but I couldn't say in that paper, how does it do it? Well, years and years passed, and I got more and more curious about, well, okay, so they can, sort of fiddle around with a computer mouse, and they can click on this and click on that and accidentally download games and pay them. So what? What else can they do? So I started asking them to do things. The way to ask them to do things is to simply say, there's something called a quadratic equation. And the children would say, what? So you say, a quadratic equation. And they say, how do you spell it? And you say, I don't know, I'm pretty bad at spelling. So, and then you go away. Okay? I did this quite recently in England with some 9-year-olds. And about 20, 25 minutes later, they said, oh, you don't know what a quadratic equation is? It's algebra. It was invented in Persia. It uses the powers of x. And guess what? X doesn't have just one answer, it has two. Okay, all this in 25 minutes. So anyway, we tested with different subjects, different subject areas, different kinds of problems, and we found, I've been a teacher all my life, so it's not easy for me to write that slide. And I found that we've managed to create a world where children can learn most things by themselves. I don't think we should feel depressed about that. I think we should feel very proud of it. That we managed to create this world, this information-rich, interconnected world with those little devices and so on, where this is possible. So all these are reported. So children, improving their computing science skills, children improving their mathematics skills, children improving their English pronunciation. Well, to this audience, that might be interesting. I did this experiment in the city of Hyderabad in India in 2002. And the problem was that we had these children who were learning English, and they knew English, but they were learning this from local teachers. The language spoken in southern India, in that part of southern India, in Hyderabad, is Telugu. And so the teachers have this strong Telugu accent. So as a result, the children who learn English, ultimately when they go to apply for a job, the interviewer says, obviously your English is very good, but the thing is that I can't understand a word of what you're saying. So they don't get a job. So how do you improve their pronunciation? Now, I cannot get a native English speaker to go and teach in the slums of Hyderabad. So what I did was I gave some children a computer with a speech-to-text engine. There's a program called Dragon. It's quite commonly available now. It had just come out then. So what happens in Dragon is that you speak into the computer, and the computer types out whatever you've said, provided it understands what you're saying. So I gave this to the children, and I said, well, read something into the computer. So they read something into the computer typed complete nonsense. So the children laughed and said, doesn't understand anything that we're saying. So I said, I'll tell you what, I'll leave this computer here for you for 2 months. And you've got to make yourselves understood to the computer. So the children said, how? And by then I had perfected my pedagogical technique, so I said, I have no idea. So then, 2 months later, when I went back into the slum, and the first thing I saw was this little boy called Faizan who was standing outside the room where the computer was. So I said to Faizan, Faizan, how are you? I said in English. And Faizan kind of looked up at me and said, fantastic. So I said, good Lord, how's that happen? What they had done was that they had been given a task, a problem, a learning objective, but they had not been given any pedagogy. So what they did was they invented pedagogy. What they did was they downloaded the Speaking Oxford Dictionary. You type a word into it, and the dictionary speaks it back to you in a very flat BBC kind of accent. So they would listen to the word, and then they would speak it back into the text-to-speech. They would correct each other until the right word comes out. And they'd done that for 2 months. 12-year-olds had invented a pedagogy which I wouldn't have invented. I would have thought of everything else other than this kind of. So that experiment, which again is published, showed that learners, if they have no choice, will invent pedagogy. And they are under no baggage. They don't know who Piaget is. So they invent whatever pedagogy they feel like. To cap all this was an experiment which I did after I came to England, where the question at this point was that this can't be happening. You're saying mathematics, computer science, English pronunciation happens by itself. There has to be something that doesn't. So I decided to try an experiment to test for the limits of where this method can go. The experiment, the research question was, Tamil is a South Indian language. Can Tamil-speaking children in a South Indian village learn the biotechnology of how the DNA molecule reproduces in English from a street-side computer on their own? And I thought, what a fantastic social science question this is. I'll give them a pre-test, they'll fail, get a 0. I'll come back after a while, I'll give them a post-test, and they'll get another 0. I'll go back to England and say, we need teachers. So I found a village. It was called Kuppam. In Kuppam, I had put in a couple of hole-in-the-wall computers. So the children were kind of, they knew how to use the computers. So into that computer, I put in downloaded material from the internet on basically molecular biology, the molecular biology of genetics, something that is done in perhaps the second year of undergraduate in a Western college. I didn't know, I couldn't find children's material on it, so I just downloaded whatever there was. The children came in and said, is this a new game? So I said, no, it's not a game, but it's a very important subject. Unfortunately, it's all in English. So, the way you set this up is that you put this on the computer, then you call the children are milling around the place saying, what is all this? And you say, I've just put in some really difficult thing into this computer. You guys are never going to be able to understand this, by the way. But it's very, very exciting, very interesting, but it's all going to be lost on you. And because anyway, I'm not here, I'm going away now. And I'll come back after a couple of months and see what you can do with this. So that if you say that to 12-year-olds, the first thing they do is go milling around the machine, seeing what is it that you're talking about. So they said, but this is all in English. It's got big chemistry words in it and diagrams, and how can we understand this? So I said, I told you, you can't. I'm going. Okay? So I came back after 2 months, back to Kuppam, and the children sort of trooped in. I still remember that day very, very clearly. They kind of trooped in looking very glum, you know. They were all very quiet. And they sat down. I said, so what have you been doing? So they said, we've understood nothing. So I said, well, anyway, when did you give up? So they said, no, we haven't given up. We look at those things every day. So I said, for 2 months, you look at this stuff which you don't understand at all every single day, whatever for. So then this 12-year-old girl, who was 12 then, so she says to me in broken Tamil and English, another one of those turning points in my life. She says, well, apart from the fact that improper replication of the DNA molecule causes genetic disease, we've understood nothing else. So back to my old question. How is this possible? How on earth could they figure this out? In Kuppam, there cannot be a biotechnology teacher anywhere. So I measured, and they'd gone from 0 to 30%. Anyway, that's an educational impossibility. Remember the context. 12-year-old Tamil-speaking children on a roadside computer attempting second-year undergraduate chemistry in English. How can this happen? But I didn't want to stop there because I thought to myself, well, if they've gotten to this point, why don't I apply our adult measures and say to them, 30% is a fail. You have failed me. How do I get them 20 more marks? Now, I can't get a teacher there. I have to find some way within the environment with which to get those marks up in biotechnology in English, another 20 notches. Well, I found a young woman. She was an accountant with an NGO. And she was a great friend of the children. So I asked her, listen, can you help me? Can you teach them a little more biotechnology? And she said, absolutely not. She said, I had no science in school. I have no idea what they do under that tree with that computer and with chemistry diagrams on it. I can't help you. So I said, no, I'll tell you what. Use the method of the grandmother. So she said, what's that? So I said, stand behind them. Every time they do anything, you just say, wow, that's fantastic. How did you do that? Where did that page come from? Is it from the last page? When I was your age, I was so stupid I could have never done anything like this. What comes next anyway? And so on. You know the method. We've all had grandmothers. So grandmothers use a method which is very different from the methods used by either parents or by teachers. Grandmothers use admiration as a method, as an educational method. So she did this for 2 more months. And the results went up to 50%. Okay, when I saw that graph, then I realized that there's something about learning that we've missed. This is not learning the way we understand it. There's something happening here, a new mechanism. But again, I had no clue what that mechanism was. How was this happening? So I published the results, and it attracted an enormous amount of comments from educators, ranging all the way from, yes, you've hit on something really, really interesting, to this is complete rubbish. You must have cooked those results up. So I myself was quite confused. I came back to England, and I spoke to school teachers here. And up in the Northeast, they took me to their schools. And they said, we have to try the hole in the wall in England. And I said to them, that's impossible, because if you try the hole in the wall in England, you're going to get frozen children. I mean, So, I mean, this is- I love this country, but it has ridiculous weather. So, so, so how do you do? So, but then the teachers insisted. They said, "Listen, I mean, don't make fun of us. You've got to do the hole in the wall here." So I decided I would try it by turning the hole in the wall inside out. So I took it into the classrooms of northeastern England. So the way to do it is very simple, actually. You take a classroom full of, say, 20 children, 30 children. You shut down the computers. You know, they usually would have one each over here. So you shut them down until you have one computer for every 4 or 5 children. Because remember, in each of those videos that you saw, there were groups of 4 or 5 clustering around. So as soon as you shut down, as you make the ratio 1:4, 1:5, inside the English classrooms, without any instruction, the children would start clustering because there's nothing else they can do. So they start clustering and they start talking to each other. And then you give them something to do, something absolutely absurd. Children love these little absurd problems. I'll give you an example with 12-year-olds. The example is, okay guys, I'm going to ask you a question to which I don't have an answer, and I think very few people know. Okay, what's the question? The question is, why is it that almost all men can grow a mustache, but most women cannot? so, so they love the idea of most women cannot. So then they get to work on this. And what happens next is that within 30 or 40 minutes, they have gotten, like those Kuppam children, they've gone deep inside the biology of cell expression, and when do cells trigger off and when do they not, and under what circumstances, what evolutionary forces work on it, and so on. That question is not a small question, it's a big question, because it has a huge curricular answer. It stretches across the curriculum. So I started to make up questions like that, and the teachers loved it because they would say, it's just happening by itself. You know, they're just doing these absurd things by themselves. What do you have to do to trigger it? And I would say, make up a big question. So we called it a self-organized learning environment. Because by now, I was beginning to suspect what the mechanism was. And, you know, I had no background in education. I still don't have a background in education. My background is theoretical physics, so that's the only lens through which I can look at things. So I looked at it with the lens of physics, and what I think I saw was a self-organizing system. In math and in physics, we have this new area, actually a very important area called theories of chaos, which says that if you have a completely ordered system, like a crystal, where everything is in position, it remains the same way and nothing very exciting happens. It just stays that way. If you have a completely chaotic system, with lots of things kind of bumping into each other all the time, that's also not very interesting because, yeah, well, things happen, but they happen at random. It's all completely random and chaotic. If you take the completely ordered state and the completely disordered state and make them meet, there forms a boundary. In physics, we call it the edge of chaos. At the edge of chaos, order appears out of disorder. That's how we, human beings, came to be. We know that now. We know that if you take methane and ammonia and a bit of water and you mix it up, put in a bit of thunder, put in a bit of lightning, wait for a few million years, something crawls out. It's self-organizing. That's called a self-organizing system, and what crawls out, you call that an emergent phenomenon. And it always looks absurd. I mean, you look at that pool of salt water with stuff inside it and it's just bubbling around, And when you see that frog-like thing come out, you say that's impossible. Somebody must have made that. But we know nobody made it. It just happened. Was this what was happening inside the hole in the wall? Well, I started testing this first in England, and then as the interest grew all around the world.
He's my cousin. Yes, he's my cousin.
His name was Paul Cézanne. Cézanne was his second name and Paul was his first name. He was French. He was born in 1839 and he died in 1906.
El mundo se va a terminar porque el mundo va a girar muy rápido y va a haber destrozos naturales.
Everywhere, all around the world, all kinds of children, rich schools, poor schools, no schools, the same things would happen. Why do igneous rocks form at the boundaries of tectonic plates for 7-year-olds in London? The answer, if you watch that session, you saw a bit of it. There's children milling around. You have to purposely make it chaotic. You get the edge of chaos. And in this particular school, what happened was, I knew I had broken through when about 10, 12 minutes down the line, I saw one little boy in one corner talking to his friends, and he was doing this. Okay, and I said, they've got it at 7, first year undergraduate geology. So that's what was happening in all of those videos, different kinds of things. But we know from Kuppam that this will get you up to 30%. In order to get those extra 20, you need a grandmother. I sent out an appeal in the Guardian newspaper in England saying that if you are a British grandmother, if you have broadband and a web camera, and can you give me 1 hour of your time every week for free? In the first 2 weeks, I got 200. Now I have 600. I know more British grandmothers than anyone in this audience. So, that was just a joke. They're not all grandmothers. We have men, women, we have young men, young women, people who have interest in children. And what they do is that, 1 hour a week is nothing much. And they form what's called the granny cloud. It's up there on the internet. You can beam them into schools. You can beam them into those schools where good teachers cannot go. And they talk to the children. And as language educators, you know one thing I'm sure, that if you talk to children, they learn your language. That's all it takes, really. So that's the experiment I'm going through right now. That's what the granny cloud looks like.
You can't catch me. I'm the gingerbread man. Well done, very good.
So, well, that's all I know. There are lots of things we don't know yet. We don't know if children can learn to read by themselves. We know that they can learn to speak by themselves. We don't know if they can learn to read by themselves. I'm doing a set of experiments in India right now to try and find that out. It's early days yet, but I'll show you one hilarious little video of 2 little girls trying to teach themselves the meaning of the English word sheep, S-H-E-E-P.
They're playing in the green bakri ship कुठे दिले चक्र दिले शब्द कुठला तिकडे शीप बकरीला शीप म्हणतात है ना आजी बकरीला इंग्रजीमध्ये शीप म्हणतात फ्रूट
As you can see, they met the educational objective quite quickly. So, The reason why they were looking out of the window over there is one of their mothers had just appeared and was asking them to shut up. I did a study in Uruguay in South America where children have had, every child in Uruguay has a computer. And they've had one for the last 5 years or more. It's the one laptop per child country, one of them. So I went to study their reading comprehensions. And there was, I couldn't get a control group because every child had a computer. But when you measure their reading comprehension, in Spanish, they read better than children in the UK or the USA do in English. And it's not, I think, very surprising because, you know, when the internet throws a page at a child, it doesn't know that it's throwing a page at him, at a child. It just, you know, puts out whatever it has. So you could get a group of 9-year-olds doing a search and landing themselves with the Harvard Business Review. The children don't know that the Harvard Business Review is not meant to be read by 9-year-olds. So what do? They read it. And they refer to it. And so on. In that process, they read way above their own levels. Now, it's a big mystery, and I think to this audience, you should find it really interesting. You know, what I find repeatedly is that a group of children, let's say at reading level 2, will, if you ask them to read collectively, read at level 6, at adult levels. I don't know how. I don't know what is it that they do, but they do this repeatedly. I'm trying to measure that. And what I'm trying to see is that if I make them do this over and over again, will the individual reading comprehensions rapidly increase? So we know that children can do all sorts of interesting things, which is what you've been hearing for all this time. But we don't know if children can learn to search accurately by themselves. Will they land themselves into the wrong place, for example? Well, the good news is that they never do. If you allow that edge of chaos to form, if you have lots of groups, if the groups can talk to each other, they self-correct. And they invariably land up with the right answers. We know that not only do children do amazing things by themselves, they're doing it at younger and younger ages. I used to think this works between 6 and 14. I've lowered one side and increased the other side. The lowest I think that I've reached so far is about 2 years. Can 2-year-olds learn to read by themselves? Well, I don't know. I only have anecdotal evidence. And I'm sure many of you will, because I can see many of you grinning. If you give an iPad to a 2-year-old, they start doing things with it almost immediately. I know of one 2-year-old whose mother, when her mother was away, I said, here, you can play with your mother's iPad, now she's away. So she, after a while, she said, I've downloaded a game. So I said, don't do that, you know, that it's going to cost your mother some money. So she said, no, it's free. So I said, how do you know it's free? And she said, see, and she showed me the box where the price comes and said, if there are squiggly things in there, it means it's not free. So is that reading or what is it? It's something new. We haven't seen that before. We have to create a word to describe that. It's, I don't know, functional reading or whatever. But they are reading at 2 by themselves. So what do we need to do as a result? I think we need to factor the internet into school curriculum everywhere. I cannot understand why we haven't. You know, if you look at national school curriculum, particularly primary school, you would be hard put to find the word internet in it anywhere. As though the school system wants to believe that the internet doesn't exist. Which is why when a child comes into school, they're asked to put away all their devices. Don't bring the internet in. We have to change that. Pedagogy needs to include the internet. And, well, that's what I've been doing all these years, or that's what I've been bumping into all these years. Give them the internet, give them a big, interesting question, and leave them alone. This is how we solve problems these days. Okay? This is how we solve problems in offices and organizations. Doesn't it remind you of the hole in the wall, the old pictures? Why don't we teach children this method of solving problems? Why is it so hard for us to introduce this as a method? Instead, we make them solve problems like this. All alone, in an examination hall, paper and pencil, no technology. Whatever for? I still haven't found a good answer. I mean, why is this considered the best way to end schooling, this method of examination? But perhaps the answers lie in the way in which offices were organized about 100 years ago. We need to bring the internet into the examination hall, because in life we will solve problems with each other and with the internet. So should we not test children's ability to do so in school? If that one change is made, if the internet is allowed into the examination hall, everything else will change. The way you set a question paper, that has to change. The way a teacher teaches, that has to change. The entire system's changes will be driven top downwards with that single administrative decision, but someone has to take it. This is the way offices used to be. You see that? A room full of clerks and a floor supervisor. What were the clerks doing? They were transferring numbers from one ledger into another. What were the skills required? Reading, writing, and arithmetic. This is how our schooling system looks today. So can you see who we are preparing these children for? We are preparing them for employers who are unfortunately dead. Thank you. So we've got to take obsolescence into account, obsolescence of ideas, of skills, of methods, of knowledge, of learning materials. It will hurt. Nobody likes obsolescence. We don't like things dear to us to become obsolete, but they are. We need to take that into account. We need to understand that if teachers are friends, then curriculum, pedagogy, and examinations can be rolled into one. With a simple question like, why can't most women grow a mustache?
The people in desert wear turbans. Some cultures wear turban strictly in functions, but no one knows about it because it is have been around 3,000 years.
About how many years?
3,000 years.
Oh wow, that's a very long time. What a tradition.
This is a school in India, and these children, believe it or not, a year ago couldn't speak a word of English. And that one woman from New York, she's got them up to speed. So what am I doing now? Well, I'm building these things called schools in the cloud. These are, they're really like cyber cafes for children. They have big screens, computers with big screens, glass walls so that everybody can see what's going on inside. A life-sized screen on which a Skyped-in mediator can come in if he or she is required, and a supervisor who cannot teach anything because he doesn't know anything. What is the future of learning? Could it be that we are heading towards, or maybe in, a future when knowing is obsolete? Could it be that we don't need to go to school at all? Could it be that at the point in time when you need to know something, you can find out in 2 minutes? My wish is to build a facility where children go on these intellectual adventures, driven by the big questions which their mediators put in. It's a facility which is practically unmanned. It will be called a school in the cloud.
আর ওকে মানুষ করার ইচ্ছা খুব, কিন্তু সেরকমভাবে আমরা পারছি কই এখানে যে স্কুল।
Good teachers don't go to remote places. The remoter you get, the worse primary education becomes. I don't know how to build a school in the cloud because I've never built one. So I'm trying to figure out a design which, really speaking, belongs to children and is run by children. So that's what's going on. It's a great big experiment. Schools as we know them now, they're outdated.
As soon as I started doing it and seeing the buzz and the enjoyment of the kids, it made me look at my lessons differently and the role of a teacher differently, less talking at the front and more handing it over to the children.
Not made of, but it's like a bread.
I really like it because it's independent and you get to work with your friends.
Korakati may or may not be different from the schools of England. That's what we are going to look for. The idea is to have a complete glass front to a building here. Well, I just built it. About 10 days ago, I opened this in Korakati, in that place you saw just now. And I let the children in. And the difference between 1999 and this was, in 99, they had never heard of a computer. These children had heard of a computer because they'd watched computers on TV. In 1999, it took them 8 hours to get to surfing, as I showed you in that video right in the beginning. In Korakate, I let them in and I timed it. From blank screen to the first downloaded game, 7 minutes. So that's what it looks like in the Sundarbans in India. That's what it looks like in Killingworth in England. Delhi, Newton Aycliffe in Durham, Chandrakona, West Bengal. I think that's about it, really. I think those faces say it all, don't they? Thank you.